of course, what you guys think of my work and what topics are worthy of covering. There's a supporter that wrote me a while back and asked me to cover something, and I meant to, and then, there's what you mean to do and there's what you actually do, and I completely forgot to cover it. But he had a question for me that I wanted to read aloud to you and then spend some time treating seriously. Here's the question. I didn't get his permission to share his name, so I'm not going to. He said, you, as do most who address the current split in the UMC, you talk generally about congregants already in a traditional church, talk that is specific to how they exit or what they can expect as they stay with the new UMC. I'm going to close this over here. It's distracting me. But how does an honest, faithful traditionalist invite someone into their congregation and do so without fully explaining to the guest what they're walking into, or at least asking them if they're aware of what has and continues to transpire within the UMC? And along that same thought, should the guest also be informed as to how his contributions to the church may be apportioned, that it may be for something contrary to Scripture, possibly an abomination to the Lord as given in Scripture? My opinion is that it would be deceptive to draw someone in, especially a friend, compelled by friendship and not made aware of what they're entering into. A traditionalist claimant failing to make such appropriate revelation to a guest would, in my opinion, be neither a true friend nor a traditionalist, but potentially a servant of the evil one, either through ignorance or by conscious intent. And I think that that is a worthy question. Otherwise, I wouldn't lift it up. So putting it in my own words, and I might miss some of the concern here, there are many congregations. I'm going to split it over two groups. There are many congregations that have just been through a church vote, and it's been contentious, and they've gotten out, and they're still picking up the broken pieces afterwards, and there still might be contention in the body. But I think more in sight of this question are churches that either didn't get to vote and wanted out, and they're very anxious and angry maybe with the pastor who didn't let them have the conversation, with the conference that didn't let them exit, with a faction within the church that caused a vote to fail. Or a situation where people are still pretty happy in the United Methodist fold, but if a traditionalist is bringing them in, they need to know that their money is going to go to these general boards and agencies that walk in lockstep with the Democrat Party, that advocate for abortion, that advocate against Israel, that advocate for sexual immorality. When we're called to bring others to Christ, how is it that we can call people to these churches that are still in a faithless covenant relationship with the United Methodist Church, or that are full of contention and resentment? So those are two different things, and I'm going to treat them differently, and hopefully that this will apply either way. But first off, if you're in a United Methodist Church that is still by coercion or by choice in union with the United Methodist Church, I think tithing really is an important part of the Christian faith. I don't think someone can be right with God if they're not sharing of their gifts and things that they're stewarding with the Lord and his people. So if the church government leadership is continuing to give apportionments to the annual conference and the denomination, then I don't know that you can bring them into the church, because you're going to be teaching them a form of Christian discipleship that isn't faithful about money. Because either they tithe faithfully and that money goes to what I would consider demonic stuff, or you teach them not to tithe, which is faithless and very toxic. So I think in that event, if your church is tithing, giving apportionments to the UMC, then you really can't bring a friend into the UMC. And that's really sad. If they aren't giving to the denomination, then at that point, then I think you can bring them in, and that's fine. I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. It's still a problem that you're tied to the name of that covenant body that I would say is quite faithless, but I don't think that that's damnably problematic. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. So that's with the giving, but and that's with the nature of the covenant body. But if it's about a contentious body, and this applies to those within the UMC and outside of the UMC, If your church is full of resentment and anxiety, then I think it depends on if it's doing this well or not. One of the things that I've said is the church has always been a place of conflict ever since the beginning. And the question is it doing conflict well or not? I don't think when people are brought to Christ, I don't think we need to bring them into like this place of perfect peace where everybody gets along and it's perfect. I don't think we should bring them into synagogues of Satan either and pretend like this is the biblical vision. I think that there is a reasonable level of conflict and impurity as long as your church is aiming for peace and purity. Then I think, and as long as it's doing it maturely and biblically, then I think it's actually a good thing to bring people into those bodies where they can see Christians speak the truth to one another in love, negotiate together how it is that they seek the mind of Christ together and how they live these things out together. I think it's actually a blessing to take people out of a world of conflict into a place where we do conflict well. And so I would point you to the conversation I had with Keith Sweat that I published on Saturday, where he and I were not of one mind about the topic of transparency in the Global Methodist Church. It's something that I feel very strongly about, have very clear feelings about, and yet he and I were able to be gracious with each other. I don't know that either of us were moved on it, but we were still able to have a conversation where we said the things that were meaningful to us and seek truth together. And I think that's what we need to model in the church. And it's okay if it doesn't stay quite as genteel and respectful as what Keith and I did, but there's nothing wrong with bringing a friend into a church with conflict if the conflict is being handled well. But if you got a bunch of grown-ups acting like children, or that have been so thoroughly compromised by American politics that they cannot, or Nigerian politics, that they cannot behave themselves as Christians, then I think that you probably shouldn't bring them in because you are going to wound their faith. So the question is, is your community going to be equipping them for the life of faith where there is conflict and you're equipping them to do conflict well? Or are you going to be discouraging them? Are you going to be giving them this pure love of Christ while introducing them to a synagogue of Satan? In which case, don't do that. So I think my brother was right to ask these questions. We treat it as a universal good to always invite people to church, but sometimes the season ain't right. Sometimes there is a fire that needs, not a literal fire, we're not going back to this arson thing, but a spiritual fire that needs to get set to purify the body before you can bring people in to make disciples. And so exercise that discernment. And as far as you are able, facilitate peace in the body, facilitate reconciliation in the body. You do not need to be one of the primary people involved in the conflict to seek peace. A lot of you know that I've had conflict in my church lately, and you can't make people do what they don't want to do, but we're still called to be peacemakers. Every member of the priesthood of all believers, every member of the church, everyone who's a true Christian needs to be able to at least speak to the parties that are at enmity with each other and say, we need to get this figured out. You need to talk to the person you have a problem with. I'll be there for you if you need a person. We'll walk through this biblically. We need to seek restoration and reconciliation. And if you have a church where people just can't or won't do that, then that means they're in rebellion to the scriptures, and you're in really bad shape. You might need to look at a new fellowship after that if there are people who are continuing to participate in life and work of the church while continuing to hold on to resentments that they've refused to seek reconciliation for. That'll just kill a church. So a lot of this question really spreads out far beyond the United Methodist question and into just the basic nature of the church, where you need to make sure that you're protecting the purity of the church, lest your lampstand is removed. Let the reader understand.